In this country, we believe that there should be freedom for all, even though not all of us believe in it. Join Tom and Chase as they explore politics, economics, and everything else that threatens your individual liberty. This is the Free For All Podcast.
All right, we are live. Free For All episode 9.
It's crazy. I can't even believe we're at 9 episodes already. But we're back with another episode nonetheless, and I think we kind of wanted to run a different direction this week with this episode. So instead of having a bunch of different things happen, we're kind of just going to focus on one thing in particular because it kind of took up the span of the entire week this week in terms of its relevance and in terms of how much it's been talked about. So we're just going to focus on one particular area this week. There's definitely a lot in terms of challenges moving forward and things that we're going to start seeing in terms of this particular area. So it definitely leaves a lot for us to talk about. But before we get into that, I just wanted to remind y'all that our show's available wherever you guys listen to your podcasts, whether that's on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. We finally were able to get our show put up in Apple. We had some issues with that for the last couple of weeks, but that's there now. So you guys, for people that don't use Spotify or YouTube, it should be available for you guys over on Apple as well. So be sure to follow or subscribe to the show, share with your friends. We've also got an Instagram account for the podcast now, so you can connect with us over on Instagram, just at Free For All Podcast, no spaces or underscores or anything. But I think that's it. Tom, if you want to go ahead and get into it, let's go.
Yeah, definitely. So this week we are just starting to see Republican states like Texas, Arizona, and Mississippi. They're moving to fully open 100%. So back to basically how it used to be. Back to normal. Texas and Mississippi announced this on Tuesday. That would be the 2nd of March. And Arizona announced this today, the day that we're recording, Friday, the 5th of March. And there seems to be growing Republican resistance on the state level because people don't want to go through another set of lockdowns and abide by some of what the Biden administration is pushing. They're really trying to push this stuff at the federal level because obviously that's the single easiest, you can get one office and then you can really have so much power to affect everybody else's life. Whereas, they don't have to worry about going after everybody at the state level because the federal level can basically just trump everything.
Yeah, they're just going to try and override everything with executive orders and whatnot. We've already seen plenty of those. But so we started to see this week, Governor Abbott of Texas was the first one that decided he was going to lift the statewide mask mandate after a 10-day waiting period, and then he was going to start to let businesses open at 100% capacity, which would essentially open Texas in its entirety for everybody. And it triggered a response from Gavin Newsom. I don't know if anybody knows who that is, but it's the governor of California. He's been widely publicized the last year for what's been going on in California, but he called it reckless on Twitter. And it's like, first of all, nobody asked you and nobody cares what you have to say. But the second part of this whole thing, this decision that Governor Abbott of Texas made, I don't know if anybody paid attention to Texas, that much at the start of the pandemic, but basically the position that he's taking now, opening the state 100%, he's basically backpedaling because he's the one that put the original restrictions in place. And it's a lot of people, me and myself included, don't care for him because he's just an authoritarian. That's all he is. He can say he's conservative. He can say he's a Republican. And, obviously the Republican response to this has been praising him for taking the restrictions away, but they're not criticizing him for putting the restrictions in there in the first place. He's the one that put them there. And so now he did this whole thing, reversing these restrictions and making himself look like a hero, and everybody's eating it up.
Yeah, you got to remember when COVID started happening that Trump's response wasn't like everybody says Trump's response was so bad. Trump's response was nothing or whatever. Well, Trump's response was really just what America was intended to be, federalism. Like he told the states like, hey, you can go and choose how you want to combat this, whether you want to do lockdowns or whatever. and I'm sure pretty much every state does this to some degree, but it's funny because these Republicans, these governors like Abbott, it was all in their hands to be shutting down this stuff. They can't say that anybody else really did it unless they did it at the local level, like which was the case in Florida with the mask mandates. It's all at the local level. The governor didn't say to do anything, but Abbott shut things down at the state level, and he's going to be hailed as a freedom fighter now for opening stuff back up, for opening the bars and graduations and weddings. When, like you said, they're the ones who, or like all these governors are the ones who took them away in the first place.
Yeah, and what's funny too is that Abbott, if you've paid attention to the media at all, he's kind of reading the prophecy that's already being told in the media by the GOP, by Democrats alike, which is that he was gonna be gone whether he liked it or not, because a lot of people disagreed with his original positions. And so this whole deal reopening his state was sort of just a last minute Hail Mary to kind of save himself and put himself in front of the situation rather than behind it. He wants to be able to damage control rather than have his reputation entirely smeared and lose his position of power that he has. But I want everybody to kind of pay attention to Gavin Newsom's comments, because it's very telling of the way the leftist response is going to be to all of this, which is that they're basically going to wait for the numbers in Texas to spike so that they can just use it as their ammo to force their agenda on everybody else. But it's also dangerous for states like California, especially because many of its residents actually fled to Texas when this whole pandemic started. I don't know if anybody listens to Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan talks about that a lot, how he lived in LA with his family and everything, and then he moved to Texas because he couldn't take the regulations and the police state that they've got going on out there, so he moved to Texas. So, people like that fled to Texas from California, if Texas's numbers don't spike, it's going to make leftists look like they've been screwing everybody the entire time for absolutely no reason. And that's a big problem for them, because if the narrative isn't true, then they run into a number of different problems that are going to be very hard for them to combat, and jeopardizes, their entire platform that Biden ran on. And then the other thing that's going to start to happen is that, the people that we've called sheep for going along with all of this, the ones that just parrot everything that Biden says or parrot everything that government wants us to do without really thinking about it, they're the sheep. But they're going to start to realize why everybody was calling them that, because, the sheep are completely oblivious. They don't really understand why that's what everybody refers to them as, until it's too late. But basically, it comes down to what's going to happen with the mask mandate gone, safety restrictions like the masks, the social distancing, plexiglass on the walls, with all that being removed. Is it just going to be a free for all? Do we continue to wear masks? Like, what do we think the leftist response is going to be? And I think, honestly, the likelihood for the fear mongering is going to go way up, because there are already lots of tweets when Texas announced this, that Texas doesn't give a shit about anybody's safety, and that anybody from Texas was like public enemy number one. They hate old people, like the normal leftist blame tactics. And that goes back into their response, and that the response is going to be to maintain that control, maintain the power that they have. And if the case numbers in Texas spike, it just gives the left ammo to use to back up their positions. But I think that if there is a spike, it's likely going to be due to the fact that there, with a situation like this, a pandemic, there are going to be people that don't necessarily believe everything that the government says, but they're also still scared at the same time and don't necessarily want to put themselves in a position of risk. So, they're very aware that the problem is more than likely overblown, but at the same time, they don't want to assume the risk of like, well, okay, what if I'm wrong? So if there is a spike, it's more than likely going to be due to the fact that those people in particular, the ones that didn't want to assume a lot of risk at first, are now less scared, and are participating in society and going out and that kind of thing that haven't built up the immunity to this like everybody else has. And even then, if the cases do spike, the likelihood of any of these cases actually really needing medical attention is more than likely going to be pretty low, because that's statistically that's what we've seen. Um, and even then, another potential response would be if the cases remain largely ineffective or unaffected by the state reopening, the left is just going to complain that or claim that the vaccine works 100%. And for them, I mean, that's just a hypocrisy. That would be a hypocrisy in and of itself on their part, because they're claiming that a vaccine works 100% when it was developed and approved under the Trump administration. They had absolutely nothing to do with it.
Yeah, they were already on this trajectory way before Biden was in office, but especially like the 1 million vaccines a day, like I said. But this is just really another example of how even if you're right and you win against the cathedral, the media, the government, the corporate force that can basically gaslight you, gaslight Republicans out of existence. Like, look at Trump. He's off of Twitter. YouTube took down his CPAC speech the other day. Even if you're right or if you win or whatever, you still aren't right, because they'll report that you're wrong or frame the information so that you look bad. Or they won't show your victories, basically. And basically how like Governor Desantis in Florida was constantly painted as terrible, yet they couldn't prove Florida was any worse for being way more open than a lot of these other states. So it's like I said, it's so ridiculous the amount of control they have when they can just turn everybody's eyes one way and away from the facts.
And I'd love if Florida took this approach, because obviously Florida has been one of the most open states during the entire pandemic. When everybody shut down for the second set of lockdowns, Florida kind of stayed open. DeSantis didn't want really anything to do with that. But we have had things like the mask mandates, social distancing guidelines, plexiglass in storefronts and in restaurants. There are still lots of major safety regulations in place. But I definitely love if Florida took the same approach as Texas, Mississippi, and Arizona, and that removing the mandates and making it a decision, and giving people the option to choose to use them or not, or to require them or not care about them based on owning a business or owning private property or something like that. If it's your property, you can demand whatever you want of people in terms of safety regulations and stuff like that. But on public property or stuff that isn't owned, you have absolutely no right to tell other people what to do. So I definitely love if Florida took that approach, but I also think that the people that are mad about Texas opening and Arizona opening and Mississippi opening, I actually I saw I think it was Connecticut today announced that they're opening as well. But people are mad that all these different states are choosing to open now because they can't force people to wear masks or social distance or do any of these things anymore, which is exactly the problem. They're mad that they can't force other people to do what they want, and that there's now a sense of a freedom of choice.
Yeah. And the funny thing is that people always think that you need a law to encourage people to use masks, and you don't. I mean, I predict that in Texas, some businesses, not all, but some of them will still require masks, and it's perfectly their right on their own private property. But basically what happens, and what will happen in Texas, is that the market, which is basically the people, will decide whether they want to support the businesses that require masks or they want to support the ones that don't require them. And the market will decide. The better business will win. The better business will, and I'm sure both of them will do well, because people will just want to associate with who they want to associate with, and that's great. But people are so scared of a virus, and their first response always is to get an arbitrary one-size-fits-all government policy to force everybody to act the way they want. And like you said, it's all about control. And as a libertarian, I'm going to hammer home the point all the time that private companies should be making these decisions, making them themselves and not government. Not just because don't tread on me, bro, but it's really the only way we can experiment and find the right solution and actually somewhat make everybody happy. And this privatization solution is something that empirically works better than government with all types of problems, not just this, but like economic and pretty much everything, social issues as well.
Eric July from Backwards, we've talked about him on the show before. He actually made that same point, Tom, on one of his recent episodes in the last couple of days. Was that we should be letting private businesses determine how this goes. We should let them determine, do we want to keep a mask mandate in place? Do we want to do away with all of that? Do we want to completely get rid of all the safety regulations? They have the right to do that because it's their business and they can run it the way that they see fit. And that will determine the way that people respond. People like me or whatever that, don't really agree with a lot of these safety regulations that are in place. I would say that I'm going to go shop at the places that are just doing business the way they've always done business rather than trying to cater to this false left narrative that we need to be kept in a bubble for the rest of our lives, because that's not how I want to live my life. But
Yeah.
if the guy next door to me believes the complete opposite and thinks that we should live in a bubble and that all these safety regulations in place are inherently good and that the government response has been great, he has the right to go shop wherever he wants to as well. I don't care what he does. But I want the right to make the decision myself. I don't like things being decided for me. But speaking of Eric July, he brought up another good point in his 104th episode of his For Canon's Sake podcast. He talked about an interesting fact that I hadn't even paid attention to myself, which is the fact that Asia accounts for less than 25% of the worldwide deaths from COVID-19, despite the fact that the pandemic actually began on that continent, while places like the United States, like Europe, combined for over 75% of the deaths from COVID-19. And a lot of people, he talked about, attribute the low death rate in Asia to the effectiveness of masks because they're the ones that first implemented the policy. But studies are now pointing to the fact that Asia has been dealing with coronaviruses similar to COVID for decades now and have built the natural immunity to them, which is why they didn't freak out as much as we did. And they're not as deadly as we make them out to be, or that many of us perceive them to be. They're only deadly to people that lack the immunity to them. And another point I wanted to bring up is just because the world decided to implement mask mandates doesn't mean that they were all right to do it. Just because you're in the majority doesn't always mean that you're right. I hope your parents taught that to you as a kid, because, that's a very valuable lesson that my parents taught me, is just because everybody's doing something doesn't mean that it's right. But, just because they did all of that, it doesn't mean it doesn't make them right to do it, nor does it mean that they're as effective as people make them out to be, because there are other variables like immunity that weren't being accounted for. Another point that he made was using the statistical data provided by John Ioannidis of the World Health Organization. The data states that overall this virus has an IFR of 0.05%, which pales in comparison to any of the other viruses that we've encountered over recent modern history. But this is the way that we chose to react to this virus. But we're talking about like viruses like H1N1, Ebola, SARS, all these different health pandemics that we've encountered over the last couple decades. We never responded like this, and they had higher fatality rates than this virus does.
Yeah. So is IFR like international or like?
No, infected fatality rate.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So that's crazy. Yeah, I know. So the fatality rate is super low. It's crazy how everybody's reacted. But there's also an article, like you're talking about how Asia has basically built up immunities to this, and that's why it's U.S. is getting more infected. There's also an article that came out of CNN, and I also saw,
Ironically,
I think I don't know if it was Washington Post or Examiner, some other big newspaper today also cited the same World Obesity Forum, which said that the risk of death from COVID-19 is about 10 times higher in countries where most of the population is overweight. And this is crazy because the US has a 36% obesity rate, and we're frequently criticized for it because it's one of the highest in the world or whatever. And yet our answer to why this coronavirus isn't working is because we don't have enough government. Like, they think, oh, it's so terrible in the U.S. and the media is always framing it. It's so terrible in the U.S. because we haven't shut down like these European countries or whatever. When, like you just said, Europe and the U.S. have had it terrible. Like, it's so crazy. But just this one study from the World Obesity Forum should be a top headline. I mean, some of these publications are pushing it, but I hope everybody really gets to see this. And I don't understand why CNN has incentive to push this or whatever, but it should be a top headline. I mean, it's the main reason the U.S. has the highest deaths in the world because we have such high obesity. 36%. That's insane. And we've talked time and time again, even with our friend Pierce, who's an MD. And by the way, please check out episode number 7 if you haven't. We interview our friend who's a doctor, and we talk a lot about COVID and then some other problems within the healthcare industry. And but we've talked time and time again about how we need to take better care of our bodies and ourselves, and instead of having the government be mommy and daddy. And Pierce agrees. Like he says, people go to doctors and they're looking for solutions. They don't want to proactively fix themselves. And obesity is obviously one of the main problems that arises from people not wanting to take care of themselves.
yeah, exactly. Pierce sort of hammered on the fact that, there are so many external factors to this virus that nobody takes into account. And the biggest one of those factors that we talked about with him was obesity. If you're obese, you're dealing with a lot more underlying health conditions that are going to affect the way that your body can respond to this virus should you catch it. And, that's the reason why obese people have been dealing with this, or have been hit the hardest is because of the fact that they're obese, because of the fact that they don't take care of themselves. And then act like that's not part of the problem. And the only solution is just to spend more money, pass laws, and give the government more power, when that's what we've been doing since the beginning, and it's done absolutely nothing.
Yeah. Actually, what's kind of sketchy too is like the whole body positivity kind of comes in at the same time as, people are saying, don't worry about your weight sort of thing. And that's all at the same time as tons of people are dying, and it's pretty much because of obesity.
Yeah, that entire scene is just, it's so, oh my God. It hurts to even think about, but the people that are, part of that whole body positivity scene or whatever, they want to paint being obese, being fat, unhealthy standards of living, and stuff like that. They want to paint it as something good and something that's supposed to be worshipped, when in fact it's the exact opposite. Obesity is the number one killer of Americans that exists. A lot of people think it's smoking and cancer, so it's obesity, dude.
It's heart disease. Yeah.
Yeah, heart disease is directly related to you being overweight. And so the fact that people want to sit here and worship this, and make it something that's accepted or is worshipped and loved by so many people is exactly part of the problem. And I talked about my personal experience with COVID in episode 1, the very first episode of our show that we did. And I almost died because of COVID-19. I was in the ICU for 2 weeks. And I also have to acknowledge the data that we have. And all that data points to my case being an outlier. Anytime that we extrapolate and give value to data, we always have outliers, things that don't necessarily line up with the way that things happen the other 99% of the time. And, that's what happened to me. And I can't in my right mind advocate that everybody be forced to wear masks, be forced to social distance, be forced to do all these other things, even if they're healthy individuals, simply because I caught it and I almost died, simply because of my own personal feelings. My own personal feelings don't allow me or give me the ability to make decisions for other people and tell them what to do. I don't get to stand on a soapbox and demand that everybody do as I say simply because I almost died because of the virus. That wouldn't make any sense. And life is about taking risks. We all take risks doing different things every single day. The biggest risk is probably getting in your car and driving to work, or driving to the grocery store or whatever. Anytime you get in your car, you're risking an automobile accident. You could be sitting there making risky financial purchases on a day-to-day basis, or making risky decisions at work, with your job, with what you say to coworkers. Everybody takes risks every single day with what they do. And the argument that we should be treating a virus with a 99% survival rate like this is absurd. And making people wear masks simply because that's what you want them to do is stupid, because you're not allowing them to assume risk for themselves. If you look at things from the opposite side, you also can't force people to not take risks simply because you don't want to. If you want to stay in your house and not risk your health or something like that because you're scared of the virus, that's perfectly fine. Stay in your house. But everybody else shouldn't have to cater to you not wanting to take that risk and say, oh, well, my next door neighbor doesn't want to go outside, so I guess I'm not going to go outside either. Like, that's not how it works.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't ban smoking because it could give you lung cancer and kill you. And we don't ban, like you said, driving cars, which is probably even more dangerous on a day-to-day basis than than smoking, to be honest, in a lot of cases. But um, we've spoken about how no one really quantifies the government, the cost of all these governmental actions, only the deaths. No one really cares about all the thousands of small, or I should really say big ways that government actions in this quote unquote crisis have taken tolls on hundreds of millions of other Americans. And but yet we have to sacrifice everything for a couple 100,000 that may or may not have had COVID.
Yeah. And I think another big problem that everybody needs to pay attention to, I kind of hammered on this a little bit earlier, but it's going to be how the left decides. So, we talked about their end game is they're going to want to control this situation, but how are they going to do that? And, we mentioned earlier that they're going to want to maintain control, but how they do it is going to be important because there's just lots of different variables that we have to account for here. Scenario one is going to be that they try to paint themselves as heroes for diffusing the situation with masks and social distancing or lockdowns or whatever they want to use. If the cases spike in the states that choose to open, I think the likely result is going to be an increase in the fear mongering in the media, blaming conservatives and libertarians alike for case spikes. Telling everybody to stay inside, threatening lockdowns again, increases in safety precautions and safety measures. That's a possibility. Or I think the last alternative is going to be claiming that the vaccine works. That's if the cases stay stagnant and they don't see any kind of jump in the case numbers. They're going to start talking about the vaccine works 100% of the time. They're the ones who perfected it, and not the evil orange man that they just voted out of office, even though he is the one that approved of the vaccine. His administration and their medical team are the ones that did all the research that went into this vaccine. They're going to claim that he had absolutely nothing to do with it, and that they're the ones that saved all of us somehow. And basically, what I want everybody to understand is that the left needs this narrative to be true in order for them to maintain their power and their image that they've painted to a lot of these sheep, basically, that eat up everything that they say and just and take everything that they say at face value. They need that narrative to be true. They need the pandemic to continue because that's how they're going to maintain power. They need these cases to spike in open states so that they can point the finger. Because what happens if they don't is that they look like the bad guys who have totally screwed over millions of Americans by costing them their jobs, their retirement savings, their businesses, and even their own family members. That's the alternative, and that's what they don't want to happen because they have absolutely no way to combat that.
Yeah, which they have done all those things. And it's not just the Democrats. I know almost 100% of the Democrats were in agreement with these lockdowns, but it's not just the Democrats, since a lot of Republicans were on the side of the national mandate or some sort of statewide lockdown, like we were talking about with Abbott. And I think almost all states pretty much imposed restrictions of some sort during the pandemic. But now they're either going to try to ratchet up government control and say it's better, or claim credit, all while ignoring all the costs of their constantly changing rules for people and businesses, while they lag behind data in every step. But they didn't lag behind finding or shutting down businesses or ruining your life.
Yeah, they were very quick to find businesses that they said opened up too early or weren't following any of these mandates or safety precautions and everything. But they've been lagging behind in just about every other area. So they'll take every opportunity to hit you in your pocketbook when they can, fine you or jail you or whatever they can do to inconvenience you. They'll take every opportunity to do that. But
Yeah.
they can't do even the simplest of things.
Well, yeah, and they mishandled the CDC mishandled, like I said, like lagging, like they mishandled the initial testing that was coming out, all the while shutting down people's businesses and claiming the numbers were so high. The PCR testing, like we talked about in the episode with our friend the doctor as well. It can be faulty as well. Yet they still shut down and find businesses. And the vaccine takes could have probably come out earlier, but government red tape. And although Trump removed a lot of that, it's still a problem, and we still have a patent system in this country that only allows a couple companies really to make these vaccines. That's another lagging thing. And all the while they're finding people and they're destroying your life. All the while they even don't even have the solution to protect your life for you, while they say they're protecting you the whole time. They're not. People are still dying. They're not saving anybody's life. People are still dying. So what are they talking about?
I think there's another point worth mentioning here too, Tom. I actually think you brought it up in a previous episode, but it's the fact that in the last year, China is the only nation in the world that experienced economic growth this past year. Every other country, including the United States, their GDP was lagging behind. We were not a producing economy. We didn't experience any growth in GDP at all this past year. So I think that's also important to keep in mind, because, if we do see stagnant case numbers and everything, and the left does try to take credit for saving us from all of this, we also need to keep in mind the economic impact that all of their destructive policies have had on the rest of us. We've all lost businesses, lost money on investments, dipped into savings, dipped into retirement funds. We've done all this different stuff to try and keep ourselves afloat, and yet they can't do the simplest things. They can't keep our economy stable. They can't come up with a policy that isn't one size fits all. We don't even need the policy. The government is what made this pandemic as bad as it was. But they can't seem to stay out of anything. They always have to have their grubby mitts and hands in everybody else's business, because they think it is their business, and it's not. And it brings me into the last point that I wanted to make here, which is that we are now almost a year to date. I think a year to date will be next week at some point, or maybe the week after. But we're almost a year to date to 15 days to slow the spread, and yet we're still dealing with the same problem. And it's basically like the lockdowns didn't work, the masks didn't work, the social distancing didn't work. Nothing worked. Nothing worked that the government put in place to try and slow the spread. And yet millions of Americans still bought into this leftist lie that they would somehow make us safer. And a year later, we're jobless, moneyless, we have no savings left, and we're basically at our wits' end. We can't even get the damn stimulus checks that we were promised, and yet there are still people advocating for more government power and for the government to add more regulation. They can't even give us stimulus checks. Biden promised that, while he campaigned, and even right after he got elected. He said, my message to Americans is that help is on the way. And, help isn't on the way. you're too busy bombing Syria and doing all these other things to even help us. And that's the problem. And I saw that tweet from Joe Biden, help is on the way. And it reminded me of an old Rise Against song by the same words, help is on the way, that talked about, Bush's failures in response to the Hurricane Katrina tragedy and the BP oil spill. It mentions a number of different, failed government responses to different things. But it's very reminiscent of that song, because that entire song just talks about the ways that government interferes with our day-to-day lives, the way that natural disasters and all these different things that the government thinks that they can handle, they do a very, very poor job at handling it every single time. And yet they're still able to manage to brainwash and convince enough people to give them power and allot them the ability to make these decisions that destroy the lives of their own people.
Yeah, and that's going to be like a frequent theme on our show, and we've already talked about it a bunch of times, is that there's always people advocating for more power and more regulation, almost everybody. And because that's pretty much what happens in our country. We never reverse any of these government decisions, really. All the regulations pretty much stay. I know Trump removed some business regulations, but there's still tons of other laws and loopholes and all this garbage that stays. But, even like you talk about natural disasters, it was the Cajun Navy, like some rednecks with little motorized boats that helped people instead of the government. A lot of times they were saving a ton of lives during a lot of these recent hurricanes in the Bayou area, or in the southeast or whatever, Louisiana and Texas and stuff. But even with COVID, it's like the real problem, the unemployment, the people starving or whatever. Who's helping people? It's charities, it's churches and stuff. It's not government. They're not getting the checks out to people. I know here in Florida, there's a huge problem with our unemployment system. It's not all the states, it's not all the federal government or whatever that's going to take care of you in these situations. And it's proven time and time again that they can't do that. And they're actually the ones that, if you really look into it, are causing a lot of these issues, are, like we said, are causing people to get out of work. And situations like the financial crisis of 2008 are causing banks to make risky decisions with cheap money and stuff like that. It's crazy the more you look into it, and yet still people are demanding more government power, more regulation year after year. It's so crazy and it's so ass backwards. But I mean, they make it seem like they put you at, yet it's government school. They put you through 12 years or whatever of government school, but they make it seem like, oh, it's all for democracy. Like you have a choice. Like the government's doing this for good. It's the Patriot Acts for patriotism. We're gonna, welfare helps people that are unemployed or whatever. Everything government does is kind-hearted and it helps, but they never teach you about what can I do to look at the costs. And when they're proposing all these policies, they never teach you about the costs. And as our national debt reaches $28 trillion, everybody's just turning a blind eye. And I've talked about Republicans used to care about the fiscal cliff. They stopped caring about it when Trump was in with skyrocketing deficits, record deficits, crazy, while was blasting Democrats for spending all the whole time while he's on the campaign trail. It's so nuts. But everybody's turning the opposite way. Nobody cares about the costs, and they're just ruining your life with all these regulations, and it just needs to stop. And every facet of government it needs to be rolled back. It's so crazy. It's so excessive. It's so costly. It damages our country. It racks up debt. It steps on our lives. It affects our daily lives. It affects our families. It affects our pocketbooks. I can't stand it.
We are talking about just how destructive the government is with everything that they touch. I was on Twitter this past week, or I think it may have been late last week, and the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, agency, their Twitter page, they posted a tweet because it marked the anniversary of the siege of the Waco compound. With Dave Koresh and all.
They do that every year.
Yeah,
that's so crazy. They do that every single year.
Yeah, they posted this whole anniversary tweet for the siege of Waco, and in the replies they got absolutely obliterated because the Waco is arguably the biggest government agency failure in existence, or one of them. Katrina would be up there with me, but going and essentially murdering a bunch of women and children simply because you didn't agree with their religious ideology and you thought that they were hiding guns that you never found. And you burnt the place to the ground with women and children inside, killed everybody there, and then you want to go and march off and you want to be hailed as heroes. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. We're not going to hail you as heroes. We're not going to look at you like you're the good guys, because it was an absolute overreach and an absolute failure of the central government to handle that situation properly. They shouldn't have even been there to begin with, but that's besides the point. Once they got there, they didn't handle the situation correctly. They made lots of sloppy mistakes, and a bunch of innocent people paid that price with their lives. And government does that consistently in every single facet of our lives, every single day. Everything that they control is a failure. They haven't done a single good thing for us. And the fact that people will continually argue in favor of the government and argue for them to be given more power and for them to control more and more of our lives is just absolutely dumbfounding. I don't understand why people think this is such a good thing and think that other people telling you what to do and other people controlling what you do is somehow good. They fail at everything that they do, and their power should be taken from them. The rug should be pulled from underneath their feet, because they don't deserve to run the country and they don't deserve to tell us how to live.
Yeah, the government, and especially all these bureaucracies, these executive agencies that were basically handed power by bills long ago and that can act on their own and pretty much write their own laws, like the ATF, like the EPA. It's crazy. Sorry, I forgot what I was going to say.
Yeah, but I think that's really all we had for you guys this week. Like I said, I kind of wanted to stick with this whole topic of states opening, because that was, in fact, a very, very big deal. That was talked about by a lot of people. It was criticized by a lot of people. It was praised by a lot of people. There are lots of different opinions that I saw, and lots of different studies coming out just on COVID numbers and the fatality rates and all that. It was definitely a big topic that needed to be discussed. But I think that's all we have for you guys this week. Tom, do you have anything else to add?
Not much. I think that was a pretty good episode. I know, like we were talking about, it's only one topic, which kind of sucks, but this is kind of, it's not just like we were talking about, it's not just Texas, a couple states, but this could be the change of tide for the country in terms of reopening and, people changing their minds to government power. Like we've already seen, like right wingers changing their minds when it comes to police after the whole, like the Capitol incident and like a lot of the rioting and looting and stuff. So I hope this is another change of tide. And, like this is just a big topic in terms of freedom, in terms of what we love. Yeah.
I guess that's it for you guys. We'll be back again next week. Be sure to tune in, but until then, be easy. Peace.
All right, have a great week, guys. Tune in next week.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Free For All podcast. You can find us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Make sure to follow and subscribe to the show and connect with us on Instagram to keep up to date with all the latest content. Peace.